Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. On ressent une énergie, une superbe énergie ce soir, c'est fantastique. Merci d'être venus. Nous sommes ravis de vous accueillir au cinéma du musée. Je m'appelle Mojane Bezadi, je suis la directrice de Art Speaks. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment on behalf of Art Speaks to acknowledge that this event is taking place on unceded Indigenous land, Jojage, as Montreal is called in the language of the Ganyangahaga, has historically been a gathering place for many Indigenous nations. These nations are recognized as custodians of the land. They've taken care of the lands and waters on which we meet for thousands of years, and today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other people. We recognize our positions as settlers on this land, and we are grateful to be able to meet here today. Je reconnais plusieurs d'entre vous dans la salle ce soir qui nous suivent depuis le début. Sachez que votre loyauté envers notre organisme est très encourageante. Nous avons du mal à croire que ceci est déjà notre 8e conférence et notre 4e année de programmation. For those of you who are joining us for the first time tonight, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Art Speaks. So Art Speaks was created with the mandate of bringing dynamic international voices in contemporary art to connect with us and share their stories with our Montreal community. Au cours des dernières années, nous avons pu voir Francis Stark, Thelma Golden, Theaster Gates, Zita Cobb and Jerry Saltz, among others. It is important to us that Art Speaks reaches as many people here in Montreal as possible. So I'm going to invite you, if you haven't done so already, to please sign up for our mailing list on our website, artspeaks.ca. It's on the screen here. And you can also leave us your email after the event. You might have seen a few of our team members walking around with clipboards, and they'll be there after the conversation. And please make sure to look for our emails if they're going into your junk box, because that's been happening a lot, and it's really too bad if we can't get our events to you. We only send invitations and not many emails, so we would appreciate that. Nous travaillons présentement sur la conférence du printemps prochain. Alors, suivez-nous sur les médias sociaux pour en savoir plus. If you post pictures tonight on Instagram, Instagram, don't forget to tag us at Art Speaks Montreal. It's also on the screen, Art Speaks MTL. So for those of you who might be inspired by the conversation we're about to hear and want to further dive into the works of our two incredible guests, the Museum Bookshop has books by both Robin Coste Lewis, so this is Voyage of the Sable Venus, and other poems, and we have this incredible book of 700 Nimes Road, by Catherine Opie. So they're at the bookstore. The bookstore is open until 9 p.m. So you can go there after the talk, if you wanted to. Okay. So avant de donner la parole à Liliane, qui présentera Catherine Opie et Robin Coste Lewis, j'aimerais remercier le Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montréal pour notre partenariat, ainsi que le cinéma du musée. C'est très gentil à eux de nous avoir offert la salle gracieusement. Et donc maintenant, sans plus tarder, je vais inviter Lillian Maurer à prendre la parole. Merci.
We didn't plan our wardrobe, but we match. Anyway, I'm Lillian Maurer, and welcome. I'm so delighted to see such a great crowd for our latest Art Speaks event. Before introducing our speakers, I do want to say a huge thank you to Mojane, who is delightful to work with. She has enthusiasm and vision, and every day is a pleasure, and she brings so much to the table, so thanks. Mojane and I are so proud to have Catherine Opie and Robin Coste Lewis grace our stage tonight. We have been looking forward to this with anticipation for months. We've been reading you and looking, and we are big fans. Both women represent the best in their field, and they are artists whose work addresses ideas that concern us and challenge us, and for that we are grateful. Robin Coste Lewis is the Poet Laureate of Los Angeles. She teaches at NYU and University of Southern California. Robin won the National Book Award for her debut poetry collection, The Voyage of the Sable Venus. And what a book it is. I really encourage you to read it. I couldn't put it down. I was enthralled and moved. It's fiercely smart, just like Robin. Literary Hub named it one of the most important books of the last 20 years. Flavorwire named the collection one of the 10 must-read books about art. Robin is published in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Paris Review, and others. Robin's current research focuses on the intersecting histories of early African American poetry and photography. Catherine Opie is well known for her challenging photographs of her queer community, and to quote Helen Molesworth, these images are bold and frontal and depict the artist in moments of extreme vulnerability. There is no denying the difficulty of these images. The desire to turn away is countered only by the obligation to keep looking. And yet Catherine's work encompasses so much more. Her humanism and intelligence touches everything she does. Whether her subject is high school football players, swamps, cities, or her wonderful portraits, all are graced by her love of community, family, and democracy. Catherine's work has been showed widely, including at the Whitney Biennale, the Guggenheim Museum, LA MoCA, the Wexner, and so many others. Catherine is a tenured professor of photography at UCLA. She also is on the board of LA MoCA and the Andy Warhol Foundation. Please, let's welcome Catherine and Robin.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody here who braved the cold. It's cold for us Angelinos here. And one of the things that we thought we'd start the program with is actually start with Robin reading some chosen poems to work of mine. So we're gonna start off that way, and then after that we're gonna begin a conversation. Okay.
If that's okay with you. Hi, everyone. Math. And then, at some point, as you step more vigilantly into the middle of your life, you begin to realize that they are all dead. Or, more honestly, it takes even more years. You begin to realize that perhaps they are not all supposed to be dead. Or, you still remember, you can still feel yourself there, standing knee-deep in cement. A particular square on the sidewalk, there were dandelions, that odd eternal sun. When a dear friend, your sister's best friend, drives by, stops her car in the middle of the street, and then tells you, screams it out of her car window and says it, your first beloved, that boy for whom you were slowly unfolding yourself from inside outward, that boy whom you had yet to kiss, but would one day soon kiss certainly. That monumental boy who smiled at you differently, that boy had just been shot and killed by strangers just for fun. You are 14, and it is the beginning. It is the very first day when you realize the world is confirming that new gleam of suspicion layered on the surface of the dark lake inside you, that yes, slaughter is normal. Slowly over the years, you train yourself not to want this. You, a body in your bed with whom you can have a real conversation. A body with whom you can walk anywhere, talk anywhere, hear anywhere. At some point, you gave up expecting to be understood. English was too many red languages at once, and history was just a very small one, a ledger and always in the black. You took out your sheerest sword, your tongue a sheath of arrows. Perhaps not by coincidence, once you began to trip around 50's maypole, you and your sister find together the courage to do the math. Of all the boys whom you had known as children, at least 80% were all either missing, in jail, or dead. Blood on the streets, bullets in the walls, the police always flying overhead, in your head. You thought it normal when boys disappeared, were shot, killed, cuffed, or thrown into a black and white hood for simply walking down the sidewalk or asking merely, "What have I done?" Normal, as expected as the orange poppies, your quiet state flower, blossoming on the side of the streets year-round. And then, finally, you and I, our bodies together for a few hours, time loves me. Every minute a gift so tender, each second announces itself. And then, just as quickly, equally, every second is stolen, erased, washed away. You. I understand somehow it will be another 4 years until I see you again. We walk through the night arm in arm across the wet sidewalk, and besides my son, I am the happiest I have ever been with another person. But it is a silence, a happiness that rare, unexpected, quiet, and I wait, and no one shoots you afterward. Or maybe this night was God's way of saying to me, finally, yes, I do realize you exist. And this one night, just this one night, is all the complete happiness you can ever expect from me. Plantation. And then one morning we woke up embracing on the bare floor of a large cage. To keep you happy, I decorated the bars. Because you had never been hungry, I knew I could tell you the black side of my family-owned slaves. I realize this is perhaps the one reason why I love you, because I told you this and you still wanted to kiss me. We laughed when I said plantation, fell into our chairs when I said cane. There were fingers on the floor and the split bodies of women who had been torn apart by horses during the Inquisition. You'd said, well, I'll be damned. Every now and then you'd change from a prancing black buck into a small high yellow girl, pigtailed, patent leather, eye-spinning gossamer, begging for egg salad or banana pudding. Or just as quickly you'd become the girl's mother, pulling yourself away from yourself. Because my whole head was covered with a heaving beehive, you thought I didn't notice. I noticed. I cried, honey. And then you were 14, and you had grown a glorious steel cock under your skirt. To brag, you rubbed yourself against me. Then your tongue was inside my mouth, and I wanted to say, please ask me first, but it was your tongue, so who cared suddenly about your poor manners? We had books, and a waterfall was falling in the corner. I didn't tell you I couldn't remember what that thing was you said to me once, that tender thing you'd said I should never forget. The moment you said it, I forgot it. I wondered if you thought we were lost. We weren't lost. We were loss. And meanwhile, all I could think about were the innumerable ways I would have loved to have eaten you, how being devoured can make one cry. And I hoped you liked the fresh, pleasant taste of juiced cane. You pulled my pubic bone toward you. I didn't say, it's still broken. I didn't tell you, there's still this crack. It was sore, but I stayed silent because you were smiling. You said, the bars look pretty, baby. Then rubbed your hind legs up against me. One day I come out onto a street in New York. A very old man is on the sidewalk selling antique maps. I smile. I walk up to him. Sir, do you have any of the Arctic? His eyes look into mine more deeply now. For one quick second, we make love, the way strangers who are not really strangers, they just have never met before, touch each other deep inside with their eyes. Of course I do, darling, he says in a thick and gorgeous Urdu accent. But, he hesitates and holds up his index finger, I have only one. We smile at each other. We are suddenly in love, and we understand our whole love affair from beginning to end will take place right here between our words for only these moments on the sidewalk. I look at the map. On the small sheet of paper, there are two frames. The North Pole is on top. The South Pole is on the bottom. All the water is white. The scattered land is green. Besides the fine black print, these are the only colors. In large bold letters across the middle of both poles is the word unexplored. Later, I will think how like this map I am. The top and bottom of me both so unknown. My most essential pivots, uncharted yet toggling in perfect geometry. My heart a country called Greenland, yet always covered in ice. My brain called Iceland, but greener than every sea. Prehistoric elephants embedded beneath my skin, along with carved ivory ornaments 10,000 years old that belonged to me when I was someone's wife during the last ice age. Always something in me, freezing harder, whilst another part insists on melting. And then this equator, so hot, so lush, I can only visit it for one day. I buy the map. It's $15. The man and I smile at each other. His face is a whole flock of starlings that suddenly alight upon me. Me, a bare winter tree. In 1 minute, we have lived 50 years together. In 1 minute, we've had 10 children. I've tended a goat and brought him a cup of its frothy milk. He's covered my head with a white muslin scarf, then stood beside me while we cremate my father. We've grown gray together. I have loved his body and mine thoroughly. I say goodbye. I rub red ochre in the part of my hair. I throw garlands of marigolds into his casket before the moment closes the lid. Summer. Last summer, 2 discreet young snakes left their skin on my back porch 2 mornings in a row. Being postmodern now, I pretended as if I did not see them, nor understand what I knew to be circling inside me. Instead, every hour I told my son to stop with his incessant backchat. I peeled a banana and cursed God, his arrogance, his gall, to still expect our devotion after creating love and mosquitoes. I showed my son the papery dead skins so he could know too what it feels like when something shows up at your door twice, telling you what you already know. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, wow. I think that I want to start with a question for you, but more also, I guess, a shared kind of idea in relationship to identity. We both love language, but in different ways. Mine is through images. Yours is through words. We're both mothers. We're both dykes. The queer community has brought us up through kind of radical activism. And I want to talk to you about the images that come to you in relationship to your writing. And because I always start out with an image, but it always is a question in relationship to what an image can convey further. And your words often make very powerful images, as words often do in language. But you also really use images in a way for your work. And I was hoping that you could just talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I'm going to back up a little bit. So I did graduate work in the history of photography, and one of the reasons why I did that, and one of the reasons why I worship Kathy Opie's complete oeuvre, is because I think that photography and poetry are twins. I write about this a lot. I actually think that poetry is an art of silence, not an art of language, but that it's very tricky in that we use language to create silence. Whereas photographs, it's the same kind of process. This is where I get very freaky and witchy and weird about my aesthetic. I try to find the words to explain it. I'm hoping that, like a photograph, that when the reader reads the poem or hears the poem, that I leave an image or images inside their body, inside their psyche. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily the story of the poem. The story is a distraction to do something else.
Okay.
And I think the same is true about a lot of really good photographs, I hope, you know. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about not just a distraction, but what it is, I guess, to begin to think about an image as a portal for me.
Absolutely.
And I think that, you know, often your work is this other portal for me when I read it. Mm-hmm. And I think very much about the fact that there's something kind of amazing in relationship to how you're present when making an image, but that it immediately becomes the past, and it's really for the future.
Exactly.
And I find that to be this kind of incredible draw lately for me. And I don't. And one of the things that we've talked a lot about is nostalgia.
Yes.
And kind of our kind of place of where we try to avoid that with all kind of our beings in a certain way, that our work doesn't rely on nostalgia. And I think it's really hard because often photography is immediately thought of as being potentially nostalgic or cliche or those things. But I am interested in the idea of like what it does to open a space up, I suppose,
right.
For a further conversation.
Well, by distraction, what I mean is really seduction.
That one's really abstract.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
I think by distraction, I mean seduction, the way that art is doing so many things simultaneously, like one image, one kind. I love that you said a door. Like, I think of it as a portal, you know, and to get the reader or the viewer to walk up to the door, not to mention through it, I need to have something that's quiet, not loud, is I guess what I'm trying to say. Wow, Kathy, I don't know how I'm going to do this because...
Just look at them.
I know. Okay, I'll turn around. I'm sorry. Hi, you guys. I'm so distracted by these amazing images behind me. I'm such a fan. So nostalgia, yeah. Cecilia D'Onofrio, the great filmmaker, I was telling Kathy, told me once, 20 years ago, use nostalgia, don't be nostalgic. Right, and that's an incredible mandate, aesthetic mandate.
Yeah.
It's hard to pull off. I also wanted to talk what you were just saying. My editor just said to me, Robin, everybody knows poetry is only about death. And I was thinking about photography is also an art of memory. That's a very dark way of saying it's an art of memory.
Yeah.
And art of the moment. So I love what you just said. Can you say more about what the past and the present and the future, what you were just saying? Because
yeah, I think that in a certain way, I think that when I, started photography, and we both started our practice when we were kids. I mean, I picked up a camera at 9, and I said that I was going to be a photographer, and then it worked out somehow that I was able to do this. Yeah. And I think that in a way, for me, it was about tracking and creating a certain kind of memory, but not a memory based in nostalgia. It was more about, like, even when my mom recently brought my 9-year-old album up, and which was like, I didn't even know she had it still, and you know, there were photographs of every house in the neighborhood, every stop sign, every fire hydrant. Like, so it was already like really beginning this kind of tracking in a certain way. And so even though they're not necessarily for memory, for me, photography and the history of photography was always about our relationship to a visual history of remembrance. Yes. And I think remembrance is much more interesting than nostalgia.
Absolutely. I just want to, that's the first time I heard that story, so I just want to stop there for a minute and pause, because that seems remarkable to me. Do you remember being 9 and looking at your neighborhood and looking at the objects and the landscape and thinking, like, I don't know much about the aesthetic of photography. I know about the history. So, like, what is that aesthetic desire that you want to remember, or you want to record that visually? Can you remember that 9-year-old?
I remember being 9, and I remember getting my camera, because it was really exciting, because it's all I wanted. And I couldn't believe that they actually gave me something that I wanted. It's like, okay, another Snoopy dog, fantastic. I know I like Snoopy, but how many Snoopy stuffed animals do I really need? But I do remember the very first, it's interesting because when you look at the first roll of film, it's so telling, because the first image is of my dad at the kitchen table with his army coffee mug. And then it's my mom in her bathrobe with her hair out of control. And she looks like a drag queen, she just does. And I love that about my mom at that point in time. And then it was my brother, and then it was a self-portrait. So the first 4 images were literally dad, mom, brother, self-portrait. And then, you know, and I actually really remember that, but not in any kind of conscious way. But then you go off to art school and they give you the language to begin to talk about your work. And I just realized that, you know, I had been doing it all along, that followed through. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting. Do you remember when you decided to be?
Yeah, my aunt was visiting from France, and she said, I was 6, and she said, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, a writer. And she looked at me, and she said, come with me. And at this point, you know, people don't like to think about LA this way. It's not the image, but we didn't have sidewalks in certain parts of town. So we walked through the dirt, and I remember being so upset because I felt like her fancy Lyonnaise shoes were being ruined by the dirt. And I remember the dress I had on, because it was this moment of like, wait, someone's actually listening to my thoughts in a very deep way. And so anyway, we went to the general store, and then we got back home. It took about an hour. And she bought a notebook and a pencil, and she made me write at the top of the page, today, I, Robin Lewis, will begin my novel.
Oh.
And I've never forgotten it. I've never forgotten, God rest her soul, I've never forgotten it. And then several years later, my father surprised me. It was like, it's the same time, actually, that this poem about my boyfriend Bradley being killed, my father bought me an electric typewriter. And that was, you know, that was like, that was Fort Knox, you know. Yeah, and I remember, like, I can still remember my mom had done my hair, and I can still remember the coconut oil and sitting at the kitchen table and starting to type, and it was like electric because it hit some profound desire. You know, it matched the desire somehow.
And then did you start, like, do you remember starting a regular practice at that point in time?
Not at all.
No. And are you a journaler?
I kept a diary every day since I was 14, except, and we should talk about this, once I became a mother. Every day since I was 14, I kept a diary. I have volumes, I mean, hundreds of volumes. And then for the last 11 years, you know, for the first 10, I don't think I wrote at all. And I just started, I'm trying maybe once or twice a week. Sometimes I do every day. It's amazing. Do you have a practice like that isn't serious? Do you know, like, I feel about diaries is that they allow me to practice language, and it doesn't matter. I can just go all over the page. Doesn't matter. Doesn't have to be serious.
I think my iPhone has become that, actually.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's like a camera
great.
that I carry in my pocket.
That's great.
I don't ever use it for my work, but it's become a note taker for me.
Exactly.
So it reminds me of what I've seen, where I've gone. You know, for those who follow me on Instagram, I apologize. I know I suck. I really do. My son was supposed to take over it, and he just didn't. And but I'm not necessarily a social media person with it, but it's definitely it's notes for me.
It's a tool.
It's a tool, yeah. And before that, I always had a camera with me. Mm-hmm. So it's the same thing where the phone has just replaced the actual carrying of a camera every day.
And do you like that?
Carrying a camera every day?
No, carrying an iPhone instead, or not having to carry a camera.
It's certainly a lot less bulkier because I'm kind of just like pockets.
Yeah.
I don't really carry a bag.
Yeah.
Never been a bag carrier, so it's really kind of a drag to have to carry a bag when you just want to put something in your pocket. So I would always try to find the smallest cameras, like the Yashica T4 was the photographer's camera at one point. Yeah. We all carried that still shot film and it could fit in your pocket. Mm. But I have so many empty notebooks in my house because I always think that I'm going to write or journal or put my thoughts down. And literally, it's like you open the first page and it's like, okay, yeah, that was in 1982 and that was one thought, you know, and then all the other pages are empty. And so I have really realized that my history is through images.
Absolutely. I was going to say that's because this is your language and you speak it so deftly, you know? I think that's what it is. There are so many things I want to ask you about, Kathy. I brought some of it up at dinner the other night. I want to talk about tenderness and vulnerability and as an aesthetic. Because I think because of our politics and the political nature that is often present in our work, we don't get to verbalize that actually, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I look at Kathy's work, what I see is incredible vulnerability. And regardless of what you're looking at, right? There's this stillness in it that really moves me. And in any case, so we were talking about that last night, so I wonder if we can talk a little bit more about...
Yeah, about vulnerability.
About vulnerability and tenderness, but also, Kathy said something I thought was so interesting. She said that she's very quick with when she does portraits.
Yeah.
And that she can get the subject to kind of open up and unmask very quickly. And I was like, that's because you're fucking good. Like, that shit doesn't happen for anybody. Like, you know, it takes somebody spends sometimes hours, weeks with a subject to get them the kind of portraiture. And I think there's something about our conversation about tenderness and vulnerability that is also about when we write or you make images of a subject or a figure. Wow, I've never seen that.
Yeah. Venice bisected.
Yeah.
Vulnerable Venice right now. It's having horrible floods right now, talking about vulnerability. I mean, I think that one of the things that we often are taught, like somebody keeps calling me, so sorry, from Montreal too. Aren't you all here? One of the things that I'm interested in is ultimately our relationship to humanity. And I think that you can make pretty tough work that has a vulnerability, you know, as well. That the tough work is actually not about being tough, but it's actually about being vulnerable. And I think that we go through like having to armor ourselves so much as people because the world is just assaulting us in all of these different ways. Especially being a woman, especially being a queer woman, a dyke, you know, all of that. Being a mother was even an interesting thing where people were like, well, you're butch, you can't have a baby. And I was like, yeah, I actually can. My body will have a baby. And so I think that, I think vulnerability for me is actually about humanity. And I think that even, you know, the idea of these horizon lines you're looking at is because of not about the cliche of sunrises or sunsets or anything like that, but it's about equality. that the horizon line for me is always in the middle because it's the equal space between the sea and the sky. And what we can do with that equality and something as simplistic as having a horizon line in the middle carries forth in this other way that you begin creating a language through that.
Yeah. And the viewer also gets to dream.
Yeah. And I think we need those lines, and I think we need, words and these images in order for us to be able to hopefully be better humans in a certain way. We both live in Los Angeles, in a city that has over 55,000 people living on the streets. We have an incredibly horrible leadership in relationship to our government right now. And I think there's a way that I'm hearing from people that they feel helpless. And I actually don't believe in being helpless, because I think that you make work through it. You use your voice through it. And that might not actually change things, but it at least changes your own ability and your own position to navigate the world that we're faced with. Can you talk about that a little bit in terms of your vulnerability?
Yeah, I was going to say, I try in my work to be as open as possible. A lot of my work is fiction. People think it's not, but a lot of it is. But that's not the point. It's very true emotionally. So the first two poems in my book, the first poem and the last poem, the first is Plantation, the last is Felicite. They both talk about the fact that my family, it is true, owned one of the largest plantations, the black side of my family, in Louisiana during the colonial period. And I purposely put that first poem, Plantation, that I read, first because I wanted to signal to the reader from the very first page that if you come with me, we have to put our shame, leave the shame at the door. And that the only way I think that we're going to get anywhere, I'm talking now as an American citizen, is for us to tell the truth about who we really are. And a great deal of that is about shame. Like, so example, I think it's very telling, poignant to me that the impeachment hearings formally started today.
Yeah.
And that Kathy and I are not there, thank God. but that we're here having this discussion because I feel like, the United States is so haunted by the Civil War and by slavery. And partly, a part of that haunting that is so poignant, I see acted out in the current administration. And its denial and its xenophobia is so loud, I think, because we can't be vulnerable and say, I'm so ashamed, or I don't want this to be who we are, or I don't want this to be our country. Hatred, Toni Morrison and Primo Levi, both of them, refused to fetishize hate. They were like, it's boring, it's stupid. We can't give it too much time, right? We can come over here and do this work and try to make the world change, but we're not gonna sit here and fight about whether or not someone's racist or something like that. And I feel that way too, and so I use tenderness instead to say, here's my hand, and you give me yours, and we'll move together through the material. And it works better for me. I'm not interested in fighting on the page at all.
Yeah, and I'm the same. I'm interested in ideas of representation. Political landscapes are marches throughout this country in terms of people gathering for activism, but it's just about them passing through me in a certain way. And one of the things that I find really interesting to balance in the work is kind of the difference of all of the different subjects. Like I can go to a Tea Party rally, in the early 2000s and be able to photograph that. And people were like, well, how can you actually photograph them? And I'm like, well, I'm not being a photojournalist. I'm not being any of that, but I'm bearing witness.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that the words about bearing witness and what you can do with a camera in relationship to that, as well as with language, is kind of the place that we both occupy
Right.
in a certain way.
Right.
And that by bearing witness, you're also creating a history.
Absolutely.
And history of your own identity within your own work.
Right.
And that's really been pretty much the main goal throughout the various bodies of work, with a few kind of odd things sprinkled in because of
Sure.
opportunities.
Sure. And one more thing about that is that I feel like if I were to write or create work, that is to say, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, even if you are wrong. And most of the time, we're wrong. And I include myself, I implicate myself in that as well. It just doesn't do anything.
Right.
It just doesn't. And also, I feel like it's insulting to all of our intelligence. We know that violence is wrong. I mean, really, we can't debate it anymore, right? We know that war is wrong. We know that homelessness. We know I feel like we keep having conversations that people have had for millennia. And we have the answers that we already need. We have them. We know. And for me to write or traffic in from a defended place of like, fuck you, doesn't really work for me, because, that's why the ancient world's so important to me and in my work. It's that we've been having these conversations as a species for a long time. We've been enslaving people for millennia. It's really easy to get locked up into a few centuries. It's really easy to get locked up in colonialism, but actually humankind has a problem with hatred.
Yeah.
And I'm much more interested in trying to get to that tender place of why hatred seems to be so much a part of who we are, and tenderness and vulnerability as an aesthetic allows me to do that.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think that, one of the things that I've had a question, and I'm sure that people ask you this question as well, is, well, what's the expectation of people who read or view your work? And I'm always so kind of thrown off by that question, because the expectation is also very much singular into what a person brings to on an individual basis to what they're viewing. That there is no kind of consensus that's universal ever in relationship to what I'm making, but that it's maybe a shared moment or an observation or a voice or a very strong political voice in relationship to homophobia, and what that means to kind of counteract that and use work in which that you can have possibly a pause and escape, but that you also are able to understand with a certain kind of humanistic way of seeing it. And I always say my expectations are, if somebody's homophobic, I don't think by looking at my work they're not going to be homophobic. But I do believe that all of a sudden a different conversation might enter their mind.
Yes.
And that's all the expectations that I can feel like I can have within making my work.
Yes. I completely agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just not my agenda. Yeah.
So we both love blue, and we talked about
Yes.
blue a lot.
Yes.
So, and you're seeing a lot of blue behind us because of the love of blue.
Yeah.
I want to go up to Norway and make blue landscapes, and
Yes.
you're writing about the Arctic right now.
Yes.
And so, what is your kind of position on that barren landscape? That here we live in these like very intense city, a very intense city that faces us every day with all of these things, and yet both of us
really
have
hot.
both of us have this desire to like empty out the world to a certain extent.
Sure.
And be left with these images of landscape. And I'm just wondering what your love and desire is around that.
Sure. God, if I even start talking, I won't stop. Oh my God, okay. So I came across a memoir by the Arctic explorer Matthew Henson, African-American Arctic explorer. He was with Commander Peary, who discovered the North Pole. And Commander Peary was actually delirious when they discovered the North Pole. He was on the sledge. Toes were falling off, didn't know where he was. Of course, America being America, Matthew Henson died destitute And Commander Perry was completely celebrated and still is very much celebrated throughout, the discourse of exploration. And that memoir, and Matthew Henson writes very beautifully, that memoir of 6 trips spanning 23 years of them trying to attain the trophy of the North Pole, reminded me so much about what it means to be African American and trying to find some safe place to be. And, it was the Gilded Age. It was 1908 when they discovered the pole. Matthew Henson ended up staying the penultimate trip, staying with the Inuit crew that they had hired and had kids with one woman and stayed for 2 years. And so that also was interesting to me because, the idea of the day was that Matthew Henson was going to certainly die being the only black person because black people were so tropical that we couldn't handle the ice. So, it just became this fascination for me. And then the science of the pole, the light, you guys know this much better than we do down south where we are, but what the seasons do, what they don't do, the pivot, the magnetic pole, the meridians, just the whole science of the place. But then halfway through, I realized that I didn't know anything at all. And it was my American centrism yet again getting in my way, and that I should research 10,000 years at least back to the last ice age. And that's when I fell in completely into these blue spaces of blue histories, and by that I mean sad, tragic histories of the indigenous populations. Thank you, Marjan, wherever you are, thank you so much for the land acknowledgement. Because what I realized is that fuck what I was doing. My project was stupid. There's a whole indigenous history in the Arctic that we don't know about, which is why I haven't been. People keep saying, don't you want to go, don't you want to go? And I said, no, I want to research what the people who are already there have said about their own place.
Right.
I do not want to create some fantasy. And that history, right? Inuit cosmology, Inuit theology, Inuit history is so much more interesting than anything anyone has ever come up with. And it's their home anyway. So, for me, this blueness has become, it's like an iceberg, icebergs have about 20,000 years of history in them, and when they melt, we're missing the opportunity to understand our own kind of genetic history. So
you're trying to be the scientist in a certain way, going into the core.
I've gone
peeling down.
At this point, I'm 200,000 years back in time, and because I'm trying to figure out this thing that we were talking about: why are human beings so hateful? Right? And the color blue, I know you guys are going, this is not what we thought you were going to say. Trust me, it's not what I thought I was going to do. I thought I was going to do some kind of biopic of Matthew Henson. And now I'm just trying to wonder about humankind.
Yeah.
Like what have we become and how did we get here? And again, why are we so hell-bent on destroying ourselves? And the ice and the icebergs and the color, the blues for African Americans, who said it? Let me just think. For Bob Haas, so Robert Haas, the poet and critic, he said he's a great translator of the haiku. And he said the closest that you could come to understanding what a haiku feels like aesthetically is to listen to the blues.
Yeah.
Right? And it piggies back on what I was trying to say about your photographs and all the silence in them, right? That it's not a absence, it's a presence.
Yeah, and I think the presence for me is definitely linked to how quickly this planet is shifting.
Yes.
And in the same way that we really are facing human extinction to a certain extent, and so I don't again think that my photographs are going to do anything for anybody but myself at this point, to a certain extent, of being able to go out and meditate with the landscape, to care for it by making images of it and thinking about it and being with it. And in the same way that I was with my friends as they were dying of AIDS and
Exactly.
holding them and being with them, there is a way that, again, that bearing witness is incredibly important. So by going out down in the South these days and photographing swamps, and the next show will be rhetorical landscapes, it's because of the way that swamps has been evoked with this current administration. But at the same time, they're the most beautiful, delicate ecosystems that are going to disappear and will be completely underwater. And so it's like, how do we, I know that our bodies hold memory, but also memory is held through experiencing it and making images. And so I'm kind of just like checking off these things that I want to have a quiet time with as well.
I am so happy you brought up AIDS in relationship to these images, right? And to think about the earth as a body that we need to tend to. That's exactly what I was trying to say. And you said it in one sentence, and I said it in 20, which says so much, right? Because she's the photographer, I'm the writer. But I wonder if you could talk more about, since the color, the blueness of it all, in relation to everything that you just said.
Well, I think blue blue connotes so much. I mean, blue is in terms of blues and mourning and what it can kind of hold and vibrate as a color, and it's a reflection of the sky and the sea to a certain extent, and it shifts so incredibly. Like dusk has always been my favorite time of day. Like I want to be kind of bathed by that light in a certain way. I think that an enormous amount of artists have explored blue. And I think that there is something that I probably don't know scientifically in terms of that attraction and of what your retina does and things like that. But it's always been kind of a place that, and growing up in Ohio on Lake Erie, which is some of these images are of Lake Erie from my hometown, Sandusky, like that shifting landscape was utterly important to who I am as a thinker. And I would often say, that my favorite times were laying down in the middle of a cornfield and just allowing my imagination to take over and have these very deep thoughts. And I find that I do that deep thinking the best actually in these quiet places. Yes. So they are my pauses, where my other work in terms of portraiture and looking at communities is those aren't as quiet for me.
Right.
Yeah.
I often joke that I'm a pastoral poet trapped in the post-colonial body, and that what I would really like to do is write about the flora and the fauna, right? But history continues to interrupt, and politics continue to interrupt. And one of the things I was also talking to Kathy about, and just looking at her work over the last few weeks, is just the versatility. How you can go from something, and I know it spans time, but even so, just the versatility in your subject matter. Like, okay, so look at this picture, and then I think about, the football players, right? And then the surfers, and then, the great dyke portraitures that you did. It's just, I think it's incredibly telling. I don't want to use the word nimble because it's,
Jack B. Nimble.
Yeah, it's too silly. It's too silly a word, but something like that that's with a lot more gravitas about your ability to kind of traverse the landscapes that you allow yourself to go in, and I don't mean literal landscapes, I mean theoretical ones.
Yeah. You want me to talk about that?
I would love that because I think that especially as women artists, and especially, I was born in 1964, I don't know what year you were born in, 1955?
1961.
Yeah, so we're so indoctrinated. Wow, I've never seen that one either. Oh, it's blurry. We're so indoctrinated.
Well, no, it's supposed to be blurry though.
No, I know, but No, but it's more blurry there than it is here than what we can see. I know.
Some are supposed to be blurry, some aren't. We were working on the focusing earlier. But go ahead, finish your thought. I'm sorry.
I don't remember. Never mind.
Okay, the territories that I traverse It has actually...
Oh, I know. As
Oh.
women that we, especially people who started off doing our work at such a young age, we're so indoctrinated. We're so indoctrinated as women in patriarchy and misogyny not to follow our impulses.
Yeah.
We police them so much. I mean, before our impulses can even see the light of day, they've been policed and censored 1,000 times. I often joke, but it's a dark joke that the longest path I've ever traveled is from my bed to my desk. Even though I've been around the world many times, that's the hardest journey. So I just think it's amazing as one of your audience members that you seem to be able to engage this versatility with, at least this appears, not a lot of shame and not a lot of doubt. But maybe that's just because I just see the final project. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I would have to say that I don't have a lot of doubt in my mind in making work.
Did you ever?
No, not really. I mean, I was scared to do it. I think the doubt was more about the kind of criticality that was happening within my education, more so than when I actually obtained both a bachelor's and master's degree and was able to just go out and make the work that I wanted. I think for me, the criticality of the voices in art school were incredibly important, but at the same time, I felt a lot of people were trying to make me into an artist that I didn't believe. When I was at Cal Arts, I did a whole body of work on the master plan community. So those who don't know what master plan communities are, they are like literally planned suburban communities where one can work, live, and play. It's basically the white flight out of cities in terms of suburbia, and I got really into suburbia. And I had all these amazing radical queer professors at the time, and they constantly would say, like, why aren't you making queer work? And I would be like, I am making queer work. Like, actually looking at master plan communities and talking about it is utterly still about my queerness in relationship to how I'm investigating it. So there were always these different boxes that I felt that people tried to put me in, and I was always trying to escape those boxes. And that was the versatility of the work, and that I really really have a great love for my medium of photography. And I have a large reach with it, both on a technical basis, but also on a historical kind of capability with it as a medium. And I knew that I didn't want to be a singular identity. I knew that I needed to answer all the questions in my head in relationship to my own curiosity. And that to do that meant to create multiple platforms constantly that were traversing, much like mapping out a landscape. Same way of mapping out my neighborhood as a kid. So it ends up being this like very large kind of mapping at this moment, but that the impetus is still within that place. So, are we going to questions now? Yeah. We're ready for that? Are you guys ready for questions for us?
I think that we kind of want to hear you for a little bit longer.
Oh, okay. All right.
Maybe we can. So we have to leave the room at 8:30 sharp because there's a movie starting at 9.
Oh yeah.
But I think if we
I don't want to be the silhouette on the screen here.
I think if we have like 15 solid minutes of questions, I would be happy to hear you for a little bit. I think we all would actually, right?
Okay.
Thanks.
So what do you think about that and within your own work in relationship to ideas around identity? I mean, I imagine that you, Robin, get boxed in quite often too, or people have tried to box you in. What is that landscape for you to traverse within your own curiosity and ideas?
Yeah, I feel like that's also the reason why I put those poems in the first and the last position of my first book, is to say, you will not box me in. And so there's a shape, there is the love object is switching genders, switching race. I mean, there's so much going on in that poem about the frustration of American intimacy and desire. How how desire and intimacy is constantly being ruptured because of our need to put each other in boxes. I actually think that as great as identity politics are, and I will be down with the get down for my whole life about it, it also is incredibly tedious for me, right? Because there isn't enough fluidity for me, just for me, before anybody trolls me on Twitter, just for me, there isn't enough fluidity. And so I try often to have the figures in my work shift in some way. I try to keep it, but I try to keep the fluidity so fluid that, you know, there are 20 genders, not 2, not 3.
Right.
Right. Or, you know.
In the way that Octavia Butler would write
Absolutely.
about gender to a certain
I was
extent.
just reading in my Arctic research about some mold that is like 700 and something genders. And it's bright yellow, and it can replicate itself totally 100% within 1 minute and a few seconds. And I'm like, that's what I'm interested in. I'm being so serious right now, I can't tell you. It's funny, but I'm really serious. You know, Virginia Woolf said in the 1920s, you know, I think that there are 3 or maybe more genders. And we're here in 2019, still like on this binary, and I'm so fucking bored. I'm so bored. I want to have fun. I want to have, I grew up with disco. I grew up in the 60s. I want to have pleasure and fun. Like, we're here for such a limited time. Our human lifespan is so quick.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get caught up in this crap. And so I try really hard, you know. So there's tons of flowers in my book, for example. And people, you know, no one talks about it, but I know all the flowers that are in my book. And I know why they're there. You know, one is because a friend of mine had a miscarriage and her name is Ruby, and I wanted to make sure she was really, really deeply depressed. So there's like, you know, there's a Ruby, there's a Dahlia, there's a love, there's love, you know? And I insist upon it because there's a way in which I just can become such a bitter, sad person about the world because there's a lot to be bitter and sad about.
Yeah.
And what I choose to do instead, I hope, is to engage all the reasons why we have to be bitter in a way that like throws expanse into it, like play. There's a lot of play, even if it's about something dark. I want to play with the darkness. Like, so the poem that I read in Plantation, you know, you're not supposed to say that you laughed about slavery anywhere. That's just unacceptable, right? But in the first poem, it's like we laughed when I said plantation. We fell into our chairs when I said cane. You know, that's not cool. That is not cool. And yet, right, if I somehow open that up, that madness open, then there's air. There's what you're doing in your photographs, the blue photographs, right? There's possibility.
Right, to breathe.
To breathe.
To breathe through it.
Yeah, I'm much more interested in that. I do get pigeonholed, but mostly people leave me alone aesthetically, and I think it's because I write crazy shit like Plantation.
Yeah.
I think they're like, okay, wait, there's a girl with a cock, and in the end she's grown some legs, and you own slaves, what? Right, and I'm like, that's right, now be quiet. And we're gonna do some real work now.
Yeah.
Right? It's a way of trying to clear the landscape of expectations.
Yeah, well, and words can lead you to imaginations where images, for me, become so historicized to a certain extent. I mean, when I made Pervert, I made it for a very specific reason. And it was in 1994, and it was the March on Washington for gay and lesbian rights. And all of a sudden, my own community were calling themselves normal and the leather community abnormal. And so doing Pervert on my body was literally about my own community deeming me as abnormal when I didn't believe that those kind of, binaries should be happening from my own community.
Absolutely.
And it was interesting because the first place that image ever showed was the Whitney Biennial, and I hadn't even ever really shown in a museum at that point in 1995. And right away, I just became the queer leather dyke photographer, and that was who my identity was.
Yeah.
And then all of these people had all these assumptions about me. Like, they would be like, oh, I was really scared to interview you, but you're really nice, actually. And it's like, yeah, I am nice. Like, you know, I mean, I'm a girl from Ohio. Like, what do you want, you know? And so it's always interesting in that way about how the work has so much more power for all these different people, which I think is a really beautiful thing. I'm so grateful to be able to have a voice and have shared my voice in that way. But it also is sometimes daunting, the expectations of what who people think that I might be.
Absolutely. I think it's really important, especially for women artists, to not fulfill those expectations. Expectations really bother me aesthetically. Maybe it's because I grew up in the 60s and 70s where nationalism was really not a pretty thing, right? We don't talk enough about that and the impact of nationalism on our aesthetic or our development. But, you know, we were definitely told, I don't know about you guys, I mean, from what I can tell, every kind of identity has this internalized nationalist, you know, judgment where you can't do that, it's not fill in the blank.
Right.
So you're not really black, you're not really queer, you're not, if you're with a boy, you're not really queer, if you're, you know, whatever. You can't, and with regard to poetry, you know, Rita Dove, Marilyn Nelson, brilliant women, feminist black poets were shamed so deeply for writing sonnets in the 60s, right? Because it wasn't, you know, it wasn't, and I understand the critique because, you know, English is a tool of colonialism, make no mistake. Yeah. Right? Many millions of people have died just because of the dominance of English. So don't think I'm saying this with ignorance. I understand. That said, poetic forms can be used democratically to change English. And that's what Rita Dove and Marilyn Nelson and people were trying to do. And so there's a part of me with regard to the kind of pressure and the limitations that we put on each other that I'm just, you know, from the gate, I hope I'm always, you know, letting it be known that I will not be put in a box.
Yeah, that's good. Do you want, should we end on that box now? And neither of us want to be put in a box? And we're going to take your questions.
Thank you so much to you two. Lillian and I were just saying we could sit here another hour. I could listen to you two. It's really profound stuff. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. We have Josephine, who is standing right there, and myself, who are going to pass the mic. Keep your questions short if you can, and let's limit the comments so that we can get as many people to ask as possible. So you could just lift your hand and we'll come and give you the mic.
All right, thank you very much for the observations and the input. It was very appreciated for myself and I guess a lot of people here. My question regarding, you talked about hate, is you think there's a correlation between hate and fear?
Do I, or yes, I do?
Yeah.
If you're asking that question, yes, I do. Do you want me to say more about that?
Shortly, like for a little while, because we don't have that much time.
Sure. I think that because I'm queer, right? And I think that because I'm black, because, you know, inevitably, if someone's going to bludgeon a queer person because of homophobia, you know, let me put it this way. I know Freud is a highly problematic individual. I know that. I love him to pieces. I think that's what it means to be black. You're just like, yeah, whatever, he's a dog. But anyway, this thing he said was really smart over here, right? Often the things that we hate, what we hate most about, let me put it this way. Often what we hate is who we are, right? It's been proven for generations. And so I have a poem coming out soon in a magazine about Trump's mother. Was she black? Right? And it's just me fucking with him. But you know, but it's like you hate, first of all, I'm like, you hate women and you hate dark women. Therefore, what are you running from, honey? There's no, you grew up in a totally white supremacist family in a very segregated way. So what is your obsession with the hatred of black or brown female bodies, right? What is it? Where does it come from? Go look inside yourself and figure it out. I know that sounds simplistic, but my experience in my old age of 55 is that often we hate those parts of ourselves that other people manifest in front of us.
Kathy, I have a question for you. Your self-portrait, breastfeeding your son.
Yeah, self-portrait nursing.
I love that. It's just been with me for so many years.
Oh, thank you.
And the way that the tattoo is just so faint. And I was just wondering, you said that you and Robin had in common that you were, Angelino's Dyke's moms. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit how becoming a mother did or didn't change your work. Something I'd very much like to know about.
I don't think becoming a mother can't change you. I mean, I think it's one of the most, for me, it's the biggest gift that I've ever been given in my life, to be able to raise my son to be a thoughtful, kind, and caring human being. And it's an honor to raise a young man, for Julie and I to do that. And I always wanted to have kids. I was like a really kid person. I was a camp counselor forever, much longer than anybody should be a camp counselor for. I was actually studying to be a kindergarten teacher before I went off to art school, and I looked at the little chairs and I was like, yeah, it's gonna be a life in little chairs, or I can spend a life making pictures. But Oliver teaches me humility and commitment and all of these other things in a way that certainly relationships have, but in a completely different way, because I'm a parent. And the other thing that's really healing about being a parent on a personal level is if maybe your parenting your folks didn't do that well with you as a parent, that is an unbelievable thing and a healing thing to parent somebody in the way that you wish that you had been parented. So it's very powerful for me in that way. You want to talk about motherhood for you?
Oh,
at all?
Do you want me to say something?
Anything?
I didn't know. I didn't know if you were asking me as well. So motherhood taught me that patriarchy is the evil son of a bitch. And that misogyny is as real as it can possibly. It's so entrenched in our culture that motherhood taught me just how deeply women actually are despised culturally, and that we are, and that patriarchies, I understood in a very insidious way that I had fulfilled my breeding mandate. And I had my kid completely by choice, and I tried to get pregnant for 10 years and did everything, expected and blah, blah, blah. But the shock of reproducing politically, that station, it's in my body forever. My respect for women all over the world catapulted to the Milky Way. I'm talking purely about the amount of pure physical labor that it takes to raise a child. Any parent, woman, man, uncle, cat, I don't care. It's so deeply psychologically and physically exhausting that because of all that, and yet here is this life, right, that I had to figure out a way to protect from all of everything I just said and keep the days open and precious and vulnerable. In terms of my work, I try very hard not to think about I'm a mother when I work, because then I wouldn't say things that I wouldn't write the kinds of things that I write. And my son and I, he's now 11, and when he was 4, he was reading since he was 3. When he was 4, he heard me read Summer, and he was so hurt. He's like, how can you write about me? And I was like, it's not about you. It's just a baby. And then you need to use, you can use a baby in a poem. It's just a character. The way you have characters in cartoons, it's just a character, right? And so we've had really interesting conversations because he's very interested in narrative. But what I told him is that he was like, please don't write about me anymore. And I was like, I'm going to. Because the page is the only thing I have. And now that he's getting older and he sees, like all the shit that happens publicly where some guy is like taking the parking space or some guy like bumps into me, he's really becoming a feminist, basically. Yeah. I mean, that's what she's talking about, raising Oliver to be a good man in the world. He's starting to see it. And so now I say to him, now do you understand? The page, even in my house, now that you're 11 and getting on my damn nerves, not even our house is a sanctuary anymore for me. Thank you. So the only thing I have now is the page. And I will be damned. I will be damned if I'm not going to have one thing in this world before I die that's just mine to do with it what I want. And so I'm going to write about you. I told him, when you get older, you can write about me. So there you go.
Robin, I remember earlier you used the word witch.
I can't see you. Where are you guys? Can you stand up? Just so I can. I'm sorry. Okay. Yes, dear.
Earlier you were jokingly using the word witch, and I'm wondering from each of you how you think about witchcraft, or if you would use that word in magic and feminism.
Yes.
And art
Thank
making.
you.
I love a good witch.
Yes, right? Any day.
I love a good witch. A witch is never a bitch, which I really appreciate. She's, powerful. Witchy poo. I'm a little witchy poo, a little bit. I'm not a Wiccan, but I know a lot of Wiccans, and I appreciate them, and I appreciate kind of thinking about sinking into other places and other worlds and imagining those possibilities, even though I'm very much an atheist and very strong within that and don't necessarily think about the other. I like to think that there might be that possibility anyway.
I love your questions so much, and I love your answers so much. I deeply mourn that there isn't an obvious traditions that I can run off into the woods and join. I deeply mourn that, and I think that I work my spells out in my poems.
I like that.
Yeah. And, I come from a long line of really psychic women. They are scarily psychic. Like my mother used to tell my brother, you better not go out tonight. Something's going to happen to you. And in my family, we all joke, if mommy says it, you don't do it. Because things would happen, bad things. And so I think growing up Afro-Creole actually, where, so many beautiful superstitions and so much folklore and so many, everything was animate, everything had a cause and effect, everything was a sign. Oh, that crow flew by, well, you know what that means, right? And so growing up that way, it's like the poem Summer that I wrote about the snake. Something shows up at your door twice, telling you what you already know. It's important to me. And I do think it's also a part of our feminist practice, right? Where the world is a lot more shimmery than we let on.
We have a question back here.
Catherine, what is waking?
What is waking?
Waking. You mentioned.
Oh, waking. I'm like, waking? I'm woke, yeah. I'm trying to be anyway. I think I'm awake. It is. It's a Wiccan is basically a society of witches and witchcraft.
Okay, yeah, I asked because I didn't understand that word. But when you said that you were a dyke, I was just so in love when you said that. I was just so in love with you because you just don't. You're so humorous and you don't. I mean, you show fallibility, like that. You don't take yourself so seriously. So I wonder, do you have tips that how to become as charming as you? Because I think I want to become
Happy Opie's
you.
charm tips.
Now, tip number one. It's really important to be able to laugh at yourself. It really is. That helps you be charming if you can actually laugh at yourself. Tip number two, go out, women, and get a bespoken suit. It'll make you feel so fucking powerful. Tip number three is perseverance always within life.
We have time for one last question. Make it good. On here, we have a lady over here.
I wanted to ask you about your work. Something like you talked about shooting down in the Everglades, the environment. This is for Catherine.
Oh, for me?
Yeah.
I was thinking about shooting in a poem. So I was like, what? I'm photographing basically throughout. I did Florida, Georgia with the Okeefenokis, and then I'll be going to Louisiana. My wife is from Louisiana. She's Cajun. She grew up. So for the last 19 years that we've been together, I've spent a lot of time in Louisiana, a lot of time going out fishing with my brother-in-laws. And that's actually how high school football started too.
I asked that because I shoot down in Florida.
Oh, you do?
I started off with the Cowboys.
Oh, yeah.
In Arcadia. And the working Cowboys. Nobody knows that the Cowboys started in Florida, not out west like the movies tell you.
Right.
But now I've come around and I'm at Lake Okeechobee. And I thought I was just going to be there to interview people in the community and so on and so forth, do portraits, landscape, and I'm smack up against the U.S. Sugar Company and the environment.
Yeah, no.
And all the things that are going on down there. So it's become a much larger project.
Oh, that's amazing. That's so good that you're doing that.
It is. It's
yeah. No, the swamps are magical places. They really are. I mean, with being in Louisiana for the last 19 years, going back, because literally there's just wetlands out behind my wife's family house, and I think that really for me though is often I start with an idea in terms of photographing, and literally swamps were because of how it was being evoked within how Trump talked about draining the swamp. And so for me, it actually started as that place, and thinking about the history of rhetorical landscape, which is actually, there is a history that people talk about the ideas of rhetorical landscapes, and thinking about what it meant to photograph these spaces that are so vulnerable. And then with the body of work actually will be these oversized giant iPhone, they look like oversized iPhone monitors, which are actually, if you go to a mall, you'll see these kiosks standing now. But I've made stop animated political collages. So in the history of political collage, what does it mean for language to be made immediately now? Because we're in this place between that portal. It's an interesting place. It's like so many of us are just getting our images off of our phones, off of wherever. We immediately get a news feed, it clicks on our watch, it tells us that something just happened. We're in this state, and so I'm using the swamps as that pause, as that place of vulnerability within these political collages, really dealing with the rhetoric of politics within America right now. So that's what I'm trying to make. Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, it is 8:30 sharp, and you have been a fantastic audience.
Thank you so much for this big conversation.
Thank you for being a beautiful home.
Thank you.